It's an Eastern proverb which says, the great teacher is the one who turns your ears into eyes so that you can see the truth. The great teacher is the one who turns your ears into eyes so that you can see the truth. Yet, as we look at our passage, 2 Samuel 17, if we're considering this Eastern proverb, there are two great teachers who are speaking. Clearly, Ahithophel not only has a track record of offering wise counsel, but he can communicate well. And then Hushai comes along, and he is using analogy after analogy. He is using picture after picture. He chooses the powerful words, the words that catch you. And so if we're measuring these two speakers in 2 Samuel 17 by their ability to turn the ears of their listeners into eyes so that they are seeing the truth, both of these men accomplish that. It's interesting, perhaps you've heard the name Warren Wiersbe. He has a book out there on preaching and teaching with imagination. And he actually, at the beginning of his book, pulls in this passage. And he analyzes the speeches of both men. If you look at the length of each and the volume of analogies, of picturesque words, clearly Hushai's is longer and includes more striking analogies. But Ahithophel uses his own as well. He's talking of bringing people back as a bride comes home to her husband. He's talking of striking down the king, which is brutal, blunt, direct language. You're talking about killing a king. In a monarchy, that's a big deal. You look at both speeches, and really the point in Wiersbe's book is he says, yes, God is in control of all of this. Yes, God's providence is guiding this event. But also look, on the human level, Hushai went into this and he was ready. And he did whatever he could to grab the attention and the imagination of these people. And yet, sharing that brings right to the forefront the challenge of knowing that God is in control and yet knowing that there is human responsibility. And so how do we bring those two worlds together? I think that's one of the biggest benefits of this chapter. God is providentially setting Absalom up for failure. That's what's going on in 2 Samuel 17. God is providentially setting Absalom up for failure. But you look throughout all of these verses, and I'm going to show you 5 different ways that I believe that God is providentially setting Absalom up for failure. But you look at all of these ways, and these are just normal things that happen on the earth. None of this is miraculous in going against how the world typically works. And yet, through all of these events, God is working his will. God is accomplishing his plan. God is setting one man back in his place and putting his servant back on the throne. That's what's transpiring. We won't see the end of that yet in 2 Samuel 17, but there is no doubt in this text that God is the one who is accomplishing his will. It kind of brings along a question perhaps to our minds of how do we identify the providential work of God? Well, in this passage, it's pretty easy. You read the text. That's how you find that God is providentially working. As I've already pointed out in verse 14, the Lord had ordained or commanded to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. But again, Absalom doesn't know that that's what God has determined. David doesn't know that that was what God has determined. Nobody humanly speaking, as far as we can read in this passage, knows that God has determined to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel. Nobody on earth is shown to know that truth. We don't have those windows into the counsel of God in specific situations like this. You can go over to the story of Job, see a similar idea. God has his plan. He absolutely knows what he's doing. He's carrying it out, but Job is left wondering. And so I think it'd be very reasonable, if I'm going to talk about the providence of God, should we not ask, well, how do we identify the providence of God? You have passages like Matthew chapter 10, verse 29 and following, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? In other words, these are not worth much. And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, apart from God. It's an astounding statement. Even 2 creatures in God's world as little regarded as sparrows, when they fall to the ground, they do not fall to the ground apart from your Father. But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, for you are of more value than many sparrows. This here, the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 10, speaks to the providence of God. How do you identify the providential work of God? You could go to all sorts of passages. Maybe this sermon will inspire that kind of study on your behalf, to delve into the providence of God as Scripture shows it, that he is in control. I would just say simply, God is accomplishing his will within his creation through regular means. In normal ways, God is working his will. He is the one who is on the throne of the universe. He is the one who is carrying out his plan. And he does that so often through the normal happenings within his creation. How do you identify that God is at work? I would actually put it a different way. You should assume that God is at work. Because he is. You should also assume that you don't know why. You don't know all of the reasons. You know some of the reasons. He is showing himself to be great. He is revealing his nature, his character. He is bringing praise to his name. But do we know specific reasons for specific actions and happenings in this world? Vast majority of time, we do not. And so the question maybe is not so much how do we identify the providential work of God as how are we trusting God within his providential work? What are our responsibilities as God continues to reign over his creation? One man says in regard to this passage, the primary characteristics of his sovereignty in this passage is its hiddenness. The primary characteristic of God's sovereignty in this passage is its hiddenness. Some of the context here. Ahithophel has already given one piece of advice that was at the end of chapter 16. A particularly disturbing piece of advice for Absalom openly to use his father's concubines in order to strengthen his hold on the throne of Israel. And now as we come to chapter 17, Ahithophel has more advice still to give. And really this ushers us into the first way that God is providentially setting Absalom up for failure. If you go to do work on your car and you get an estimate from a mechanic, you have the mechanic printed out so that you have it on paper in front of you, and then you go to another mechanic. You just want to price compare. So what do? Well, you take that nice estimate, and before the mechanic even sees your car, you hand over that estimate. No, absolutely not. You don't do that. Because now you're basically giving that mechanic a leg up on you, not just on the other mechanic, but on you. You're giving him advantage. No, you bring in your car and you say, I'm just trying to understand how much it's going to cost to fix this problem. Can you give me an estimate? And you really probably feel no obligation to tell that second mechanic that you're shopping for different. I mean, you can say that. You don't have to say that. What does Absalom do here? After Ahithophel gives his advice, he then, as this untested upstart, says, well, call in Hushai. Let's hear what he has to say. That's not necessarily bad, except he doesn't know Hushai serves David. But then in verse 6, thus has Ahithophel spoken. Shall we do as he says? This inexperienced would-be king shows his hand. Here's Ahithophel's plan. You know, we could just see that as the mistake of some young king. Or we could choose to see that God is at work. He is causing this man's inexperience to hurt him, even from how he presents it to Hushai. To put it more simply here, how is God providentially setting Absalom up for failure? Well, first, Absalom chooses Hushai's crafty plan. That is part of God's greater work. That Absalom, this inexperienced king, chooses Hushai's plan instead of Ahithophel's plan. God works through the decisions of mankind. I don't mean to skip over Ahithophel's plan. You could discern 4 parts here if you were going slowly. He wants to choose about 12,000 men to go with him that very night to find David. That's part 1. He wants to strike when the other side is weak and cause panic. That's part 2. He wants to focus only on David, chase everybody else away so that finally the last person left, we trap David and kill him. And 4, and this kind of wording, while crafty, is also disturbing. Notice what Ahithophel says this will do. And so I will bring the people back to you as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace. Isn't it scary that some people are willing to use such words as peace and accomplish them in such disturbing ways? But Ahithophel's advice is to the point. He himself will lead the charge. Absalom can stay back in safety. This strike force that we can gather quickly will come at once this very night before David can get away. They're already disturbed. Let's use that to our advantage and frighten everybody possible so that there's the least amount of human cost as we can manage. But David does need to go, Absalom. We need to take him out. Kill David, and there can be peace. Another disturbing part of this is it's not just Absalom that approves, but it's all the elders of Israel, verse 4. Now, this group has probably seen men be replaced, but you could go back to 2 Samuel 5:3, and it is the elders of Israel who have put David on the throne. That was many years ago, but it's not just Absalom that is swayed by this advice, it's also the elders, those who have influence in this decision. Well, Absalom gives an opening to Hushai, and Hushai takes it. And so David's plant, which is really God's plant, is able to speak. Hushai goes in swinging. After all, he has his moment. This is why he's there. He is there to upset, to undermine the counsel of Ahithophel, so that he makes no bones about it in his very first statement. And he says words which very few others in the entire kingdom are bold enough to say. This time, the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good. It's almost like people would say this and look around to make sure nobody else is listening. They don't want to be proven a fool. Ahithophel's counsel has been that good. And let's just be clear here. Hushai is dead wrong on this. We know that because in verse 14, heaven's verdict is given. The Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel. Now, I don't mean good as in righteous. I don't think the text means that. No, what's being pointed out is Ahithophel gave the word that Absalom needed in order to establish his throne. Again, the word crafty fits really well here. So even heaven recognizes that Ahithophel has given the advice that Absalom needs. But as is so often the case, it's not the best advice that is followed, even here. You could break down Hushai, who speaks more here, more words, more volume, more illustrations, more analogies. Hushai's plan, you could really break it down to two parts. You need more men, and Absalom, you need to lead them. That's effectively his plan. But along the way, notice how he, again, in a crafty, skillful way, says things in such a... He is playing to the fear and the pride of Absalom. Where do you see that? Right away in verse 8. You know, there's emphasis there. Absalom, you even know. Your father, his men, they are mighty men. Now, does Absalom need that kind of reminder in this moment? Perhaps. What is Hushai trying to do? He's trying to slow this young king down. And so he's saying these with the pretense of devotion to Absalom, but really he is just grabbing onto that fear. He's using Absalom's knowledge against him. And so he uses these picturesque illustrations, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Well, that communicates pretty well. He's an expert in war, Absalom. Absalom is well aware of that. After all, surely he has heard the refrain, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. That little ditty has not gone away, I'm sure. And then he's, what I go back to with that Eastern proverb, he is speaking to their ears, but he's opening their eyes here. Getting them to see what's happening. Surely you know Absalom, he's not going to spend a night with the people. Remember, he is amazingly skillful at hiding himself somewhere. Who knows where? And just when we go to descend in our hasty Ahithophel wrong plan, just as we do that, if the first line of troops fall, surely panic will set in because they face veterans. And your throne will be lost. Even the valiant man among you, his heart is like a lion. Even that man will melt with fear. Because just in case you've forgotten, I said it recently, let me say it again. Your father is a mighty man. I wonder how many people in the court understood what Hushai was doing. The elders of Israel were swayed. Absalom was swayed. Ahithophel, not so much. And so he says, no, instead, from Dan to Beersheba, that's a statement encompassing the whole nation. No, take your time, Absalom. Gather a massive force that wherever David is, once that force rolls in, we will squash him. He will not be able to hide. Maybe this is playing to some history. Saul would chase him just with a small contingent. Saul was wrong. We need the whole nation of warriors to come after David. That is what's required. If you're thrown off when we get to verse 13, if he goes into a city, we'll bring ropes, you might think, what do ropes have to do against a city? Is this some ancient tactic of which I'm unaware? It might be. If you put hooks on the end of those ropes and you throw the hooks over the wall and enough men pull, then you can drag down the wall. And if you hear that and say, surely not. We don't know what these walls were made of back in those days. Or I should say, perhaps these walls were more open to such attacks. But I also remember one summer when I was in camp ministry, it's similar to youth ministry, all kinds of things can happen in camp ministry. And so there was this game that we played one time. We had many weeks, but we just did this game once. It was good enough to put it to rest afterwards. Ahead of time, we made these wooden sleds. Somebody could ride on the sled and attached, this was not my idea, before you put this on me. But we attached these wooden sleds to ropes, and we attached the rope to a gator. Not a live gator, but a John Deere gator. And I don't remember all of the details, bodies were flying, we can just say that. But what we learned is that as strong as the gators were, there were people that were pulling on the rope. And when the person driving the gator went to apply the brake to slow things down, the human force on the rope easily overrode the brake force on the gator. So that the people that were pulling in their excitement to win the game had no clue that the gator behind them was rolling over people as it continued following us. I don't know the end result. I just know that we never did that again. And so that's the story that I think of when I see we can use ropes against a city wall to bring it down. Well, if you put hooks on the ends of those ropes and you have enough men on those ropes who are yanking, apparently there was this kind of approach that even if it was made, he mentions not even a pebble will be found in the city. There must have been some kind of rocks that were part of this wall. And so they would hook the wall, they would gather enough people, drag the wall down and not stop there. But if they had enough force, let's just keep bringing all those rocks down into the valley so the city would have to work very hard to bring the rocks back up and establish their wall once again. There's a long explanation to people who no longer live in walled cities about warfare in those days. At the end of this advice, though, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. And God saw it as wise to not leave it there, but to make sure that the reader understands very clearly this was not just a matter of one man standing up as an orator and giving his plan, another man standing up to combat that plan, and his wisdom winning the day. It was not that. At the end of the day, God had decided Absalom would suffer harm. And so he did not allow Ahithophel's plan to stand. And we can go back to chapter 15, verse 31, and David, when he hears that Ahithophel, his wise counselor, has gone over to Absalom's side, he prays, "O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Ahithophel's counsel is very fitting for this situation, but Absalom hears it as a lesser plan, and God answers David's prayer. There are different ways we can respond even to the first 14 verses here. One thing that's interesting and maybe a little disturbing to us to point out is in verse 14, we have a familiar word coming up. Remember in chapter 12, God had pronounced evil on David and his house in response to David's sin of having Uriah murdered and taking Bathsheba. And so we've been tracking how God has been bringing evil to David's house. Well, in verse 14, the Lord had decided to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel so that he might bring harm upon Absalom. And I don't believe it's any accident that the word there that is translated, and rightly so, harm, is that same word. God had decided to bring evil upon Absalom. I want you to remember that because I want to come back to that at the end of our study of this passage. It's right to interpret it as harm because this term is a very broad term. It can refer to trouble. It can refer to harm as we see it here in the passage. But I do believe that this is purposely connected to what's been happening in the story of 2 Samuel. We could also talk about life on the human level and life on God's level. Here are all these people, and if we think that there is order to all of these events, then we're not reading the passage correctly. There's a bit of chaos that's going on here as Absalom has marched into Jerusalem right as David brought his people out. Things are happening very quickly. I mean, Hushai is trying to pass on and say, look, David cannot stop tonight. This is an all-nighter. Keep going. You must cross the Jordan. There's an urgency to Hushai's message that he will pass through. All these people doing all of these things, and yet God is working through those events. And so you step back, and I think it's a very human thing to do to ask, well, does my choice really matter in all of this thing? Do my actions really matter? If God has decided what God will do, then who am I to think that I have any part to sway how things go? Now, that's the wrong reaction, a fatalistic view of the world, and it's not consistent with Scripture. Why do we have commands in the Bible? Because God expects things of his people. So we should not turn to a fatalistic view of things. I really think the better response in that kind of conversation is to warn us that we not just see the world on the human level. Well, how do I see God's work? You want me to see beyond the human level? I don't have eyes to see into the courtroom of heaven. And you're right. You don't. But you still have responsibility. Well, how do we describe the human responsibility of knowing that God is working and yet only seeing what we can see here, only hearing what we can humanly hear? Go through the human senses. We are limited people. What are you expecting of us? Well, it's this expectation that God has had from his people, for his people from the beginning. It's a short word, but it is a necessary word. It's the word faith. In other words, maybe it's not so much that we see with crystal clear sight. It's that we know there is more to this world than what we can see and hear. Have you given up on that? Are you allowing what you see and determine in your limited capacity? And I'm not just hating on you. This is absolutely true of me as well. Have you faced your limitations this last week? You recognize them before God? Even with all the news and the information that is at our fingertips, even if you said, well, we have far better sight of what's happening on the world today, I can go and research this and I can hear this news and I can read this book, you're still limited because at some point your eyes will no longer read those words. At some point your ears will not keep hearing the news cycle because you're limited. At some point your body will fall asleep. At some point, you'll cease comprehending. At some point, a report that you read will be wrong and you won't know it. We are limited. God has not called us to understand all the happenings in his courtroom today. But he does expect us to trust him as he continues to rule this universe. And he fully sees it within his right as God to act even if we don't understand what he's doing. That is not because he hates us. That is not because we have failed him. That is not because he takes joy in the suffering of his people. That's because he is God and we are not. We are incapable of fully grasping what he is doing because we are incapable of fully grasping God. Beware of seeing only on the human level. Maybe I can change that just a little bit to say beware of forgetting the divine level. Beware of forgetting that God continues to rule this world. How often is 2 Samuel 17, verse 14, true in our lives, though we don't know it? If there's any conversation that I think, any meditation, any imagination that I would encourage you to try sometime later today, it's this one. Sit down, keep 2 Samuel 17 before you. If even better, if you can do this with somebody else, keep that verse there before you and start asking the question, where might this be happening in my life right now? Where might it be that God has commanded to do one thing in order to accomplish something else? Where might it be that God is specifically involved in my life right now, in my family's life right now, in our church right now, in our state, in our nation, in the world right now, where he is doing one thing to accomplish something else? Where might that be? And I hope you don't stop just with asking that question, but perhaps start the conversation like that. And I firmly believe that is a conversation that can lead you to hope. That is a conversation that can lead you to persevere, to endure, to grow more like Christ. That is a conversation that can help you fight against bitterness towards God and instead receive from God what he is giving to you. That is a conversation that will drive you to the promises of Scripture. That is a conversation that will drive you to the nature and the character of God. That is a conversation that will help you to stand in the strength of Jesus Christ. Do not forget that there is more to this world than what we can see and experience ourselves. It's interesting. I'll again read from somebody else here. God is not absent, but neither is he obvious in this story in 2 Samuel 17. Sometimes we must be told, lest we become too enamored with our Hushais. God is not absent, but neither is he obvious. Sometimes we must be told, lest we become too enamored with our Hushais. Absalom's choice to have Hushai in his confidence brings another bad result. So one way that God is providentially setting Absalom up for his failure is he uses Absalom's choice against him. His choice of Hushai's advice. Another way that God is providentially setting Absalom up for failure here is he works through Absalom's failure to capture David. In other words, Absalom allows David to get away, and God uses that to bring harm to Absalom as well. you can see in verse 15 that Hushai is still not sure how this situation will play out. And so the best he can do is make sure David knows, this is what Ahithophel said, this is what I said. And if the king changes his mind again and decides to come after you tonight, David, you're in trouble. So do not stop. You must keep pushing. That's what he's talking about with do not stay tonight at the fords of the wilderness, but by all means pass over. Otherwise, his force, if it comes, will swallow you up. There's some geography that's in the text here, and Rogel would have been just outside the walls of Jerusalem. And so there's this spring in the area. People outside the walls could go and get water. And as a result, that would have been a meeting place for people. You could have tried to blend in that spot. So these two boys are waiting for the message so that they can go and talk to David, pass it along. They should be able to hide among the people there. But just as things happen, the young man sees them and he babbles a story on to Absalom. You can still see the haste in the text, verse 18. So both of them went away quickly and came to the house of a man in a nearby place, Bahurim. They end up getting hidden in this well. And so they're covered. You see Absalom's servants. These people are the greasy servants in the story. I mean, if you watch dramas, you can pick these kind of people out. They enter in the mood changes of the story. If a child's watching, they turn to you and say, I don't like that person. Now, I don't know what Absalom's servants look like, but we can tell their track record by now. They've been involved in the murder of Amnon. They've burned Joab's fields. Now they are searching for David's messengers. The woman, rightly so, has no obligation towards them. She throws them off the trail. They cannot find the two messengers, and so they return to Jerusalem. The men, in their haste, then the boys go on to King David. Now, the story is told of how the marathon came about and this historic deed of this messenger going all these miles to pass on. Well, this would have been quite the trek as well. Again, it's roughly about 20 miles that David and his people are going. And then at the end of that trek, they're crossing the Jordan River. And now these two boys have to catch up to that force and say, hey, you keep pushing, keep going. There is drama in this text. It's really a similar story to Rahab in Joshua 2, hiding the spies of Israel. The woman lies to Absalom's servants who have not been honorable to this point. And then you get to verse 22. Then David arose and all the people who were with him, and they crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, not one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. An overnight crossing of the Jordan River. And they must do that in order to get away from danger. Recognize here that even if wrongdoers have the upper hand for a time, God is still at work. Well, how do we see God at work in this story? God has more people in place than we realize. These boys are on the run, and they come to a sympathizer. They just happen to come across somebody who will not only hide them, but lie for them. God has people in place. He is working in ways that we cannot see. He is bringing together conversations we never thought would happen. He is giving us opportunities to serve Christ that we never would have even dreamed of, if only we use eyes of faith to see his world. Even if wrongdoers have an upper hand for a time, God is still working. And we see that in this story because in all of the craziness that is happening inside Jerusalem and around Jerusalem, still messengers squeak through the gates, if you want to say it that way, and they arrive in David's presence and tell him what he needs to hear. And you might say, well, Absalom's not following overnight. It's not necessary to keep pushing. But that would just be missing the rest of the story. Not only do they stop after not only do they cross the Jordan, but they keep going from there. Let's pause that, though, just long enough to see verse 23. In a way, this halts the story, but it doesn't. As all of this commotion is happening, there's one man who is plodding away on his animal, on his donkey, heading towards his home. It's a man who has been in the middle of so much, has given counsel to kings. And he makes his way to his home, sets his house in order, and commits suicide. He hangs himself. It's a shocking insertion into the story. If any man saw what's happening clearly, I would propose that it's Ahithophel. You could go to maybe a couple different reasons of why he might do this. I think the strongest reason is that he knew what would happen if Hushai's plan was carried out. He did not want to give David time, and Absalom has chosen to give David time. What happens if you give David time? The people whom God has planted, Ahithophel would not think this way, the people whom God has planted in the nation, the people whom David has loved over time, the people who still support the king would rise up. You give him long enough and he won't always be unsteady. This man has fought on the battlefield. He has led others into battle. He knows how to adapt. And he's not alone. So Ahithophel knows he can carry then the end of that story out. At some point, David will again sit on the throne. And once David sits on the throne, at some point the king will look to bring justice. And who will be in the king's sight when he decides to bring justice? Benedict Arnold, the traitor. And so Ahithophel saves him the trouble and saves himself the greater shame, and he takes his life. It's a sad part in the story because even if we can put together the pieces, can we ask, is it necessary? In God's kingdom, is this kind of result necessary for traitors? In God's kingdom, is this kind of judgment necessary? We look even at David, who commits adultery and murder and receives forgiveness from God. The consequences still, but he is granted forgiveness. Can we not go back to that story and say, even in his failure, Ahithophel does not need to land at suicide? Because this is not what God is like. In other words, is it necessary for Ahithophel to die in shame in some way for his betrayal of David's throne? At the end of the day, I would say it's not necessary. Are consequences necessary to the traitor of Israel? Yes. Is it necessary for him to die in shame? To die by his own hand? See, I would still cling to the possibility of grace from God, even in this situation. I would still cling to the message that even the worst of what we do is still forgiven by the God who hears. Even our rebellion, even our adultery, even our murder, even our coveting, even our worshiping of false gods, even our treating the true God as if he is no God. Any sin that you can put in there. The grace of God. The grace of God is greater. It was a little disturbing to me as I was studying this part of the text. I came across one resource that said in that day, suicide sometimes was an honorable choice. Not in God's nation. I cannot see that as being an option. Really, if you look at the law of Moses, can you say in any situation that suicide is an honorable option? Please no. Don't land there. Well, it's better than... If you're comparing suicide to anything else and seeing suicide as better, then that shows the depth of misery that you're facing right now. That gives just a hint about the shame that is weighing on your shoulders if you're considering that option. If you're considering that option, it's very likely that you would look at me and say that I do not understand what you're facing. And you are very likely right. If you are considering that as an option because of how life is or has been, or everything is overwhelming you, Ahithophel did not have to end this way. And the strongest reason that I can give for that is he didn't have to end this way because David didn't have to end this way. And if God shows grace to David, who has sinned as he has, is he not able to show grace to others? Do not end this way. Do not conclude that you are beyond the saving hand of God. That is why we preach the gospel. That is why we declare Christ. Because all of us are beyond our own ability to save ourselves. All of us have put ourselves against God time and time again. All of us are even born among those who are opposed to God. We're born on the wrong side. And so if your life, or maybe what others have done to you, maybe what you yourself have done, if you have concluded that your best option is probably this option of taking your own life, I would have you hear of the grace of God yet one more time. I would have you consider Christ one more time. Because your grace, or your sin, is not more powerful than the grace of God as he shows it through Christ. Your sin cannot compete with the God who saves. Well, time does prove to be on David's side. Absalom chooses Hushai's crafty plan. Absalom lets David get away. Absalom loses Ahithophel. And here's another mistake from Absalom. He allows David to reach a stronghold. Verses 24 to 26. Place names matter, even if they mean nothing to us when we first read them. Mahanaim has been mentioned before. Back in chapter 2, verse 8, it's the capital of Ishbosheth, who is reigning the northern kingdom of Israel. It's very likely that there is at least the remnant of a stronghold there, and possibly still an operating fort. David reaches a place of, humanly speaking, safety. And that's yet another measure, another evidence that God is working against Absalom, that he would allow David enough time not just to get away from imminent danger, but also to get somewhere that has some measure of protection. Absalom's task is becoming more and more challenging. You see a little bit of the operations of the army here, verse 25. Another person of the relatives of David and Absalom is put in charge of the army, a man named Amasa. He has a certain lineage there that is given. And now, again, this is contrary to Ahithophel's advice, Israel is encamped in the land of Gilead, but also Absalom is there too. The armies are getting closer together. There are times when we have the opportunity to do what is good and to be a blessing to others. And in those opportunities, we really don't see any way that those actions from us would benefit us. It's just an opportunity to serve others. Maybe even at cost. Cost of time, cost of energy, cost of funds, cost of attention, a cost to work. There are all kinds of costs that we can pay in trying to do good to others. And we so often don't have any clue about how God might use those actions in the future. And you might even try to protect yourself from going down that road too far. I don't want to be motivated in my love towards you in such a way that I think, well, if I do this for you, what might that person do for me in the future? We don't want to think that way. But I do want you to see here, in the last part of the text, this wonderful truth that comes through of you reap what you sow. Now that can be a very heavy truth if you've been sowing seeds of wickedness and unrighteousness. But it's meant to be a blessing to God's people. See, the fifth evidence that God is providentially setting Absalom up for failure is others bring David needed support. Again, we see names and places and they don't maybe mean much to us at first. David comes to Mahanaim and he meets three men, Shobi, Machir, and Barzillai. As we meet these men, we see more about them. Shobi is the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites. Now, again, we have to do our study, but people of that day would instantly know this was a special man. See, Nahash had been the king of the Ammonites, and he had ruled in Rabbah. David had some kind of positive relationship with him, and when Nahash had died, that's when David had sent his messengers to express condolences. But it wasn't in that moment Shobi that was taking the throne, it was Shobi's brother. That didn't go well. Nahash's other son offends not only David, but the nation of Israel. And so David really sends the troops of Israel to squash the rebellion. Shobi is another son of that former king. And it's astounding to me that Shobi would show up. It makes me wonder questions that I can't answer. Like, did David really have a good relationship with Nahash's family and there's just that one black sheep that ends up being king? Was Shobi here because he just knew this was a good moment? Like, I have trouble seeing how this would be to Shobi's advantage unless there was something good going on. Because if Shobi was still against, like, basically sitting back and just musing on all the negative things Israel had done to his people, this would be the moment to strike David. He doesn't do that. He blesses David. Well, why? Why would you do something like that? I can't answer that question. But I tend to think that it goes back to some of the loyalty that David had shown to Nahash. And that's textual. That's in the text back, I believe, in chapter 10. Machir we've met as well Back in 2 Samuel 9, another time when David is trying to show loyalty or kindness. In that situation, he's trying to show kindness to his friend Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth, till that time, had been taken care of by Machir. In other words, Machir had some kind of loyalty to Saul's family, to Jonathan's family, and was taking care of a crippled son. And yet, as David showed kindness to Mephibosheth, now, fast forward years later, who's showing up to help David in his time of need? A man who had been showing kindness to Saul's family now shows up to show kindness to David's family. Can we not see the connection there of David showing kindness and this man going, oh, this is what David's like. And now he has the opportunity to show kindness in response. It's beautiful. This is the kind of thing that God does as his people honor him and love others. Barzillai, I don't know the background of, but we will meet him again. This wizened man who has means. And so you see this long list of what they bring. And this time is so different than what we had at the beginning of chapter 16, with Ziba taking advantage and providing for David's followers. There is no hint of these men taking advantage of David. They are there to bless generously. It's beautiful. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. David's kindness and his rule have brought a harvest of help. God works through the principle of you reap what you sow. That's going towards both David and towards Absalom. To the one, it's a blessing. To the other, it's a sign of coming disaster. In all of this, God is working. God works through Absalom's decisions. God works through Hushai's dramatic courtroom speech. God works as the messengers are on their way to David. God works in even a man's spiraling into shame and taking of his own life. God works as David's group crosses the Jordan River and finds this stronghold. God works as these three men show up with a load of supplies for David's people. God is at work to bring disaster on Absalom, and he is at work for David, his servant. I want you to compare two men here, and it's not hard to figure out which men, Absalom and David. Both men have sinned against God. The one man has responded eventually by the kindness of God, has responded with repentance. And God is bringing consequences, but he is also showing astounding grace. The other man continues in his rebellion against God, and we know that because he is not God's choice to be king of Israel. God has already made a choice in choosing David. The other man persists in his sin, and so God works to bring harm upon Absalom. David experiences the grace of God as one of God's own people. Absalom experiences the judgment of God as he continues in rebellion against the God of Israel. I bring you to the testimony of a Gentile, the testimony of a man who had known power the like of which you could argue no other human being has known. Nebuchadnezzar. God humbled Nebuchadnezzar in a way that very few people have been humbled. Daniel 4:34 and following says, "At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever." This is a man who had been living in rebellion against God. This is a man who was not part of the people of God. This is a man whose pride, whose heart had been exalted against the one true God. This is a man who we can just safely assume had been living as a pagan because he had been living as a pagan. Sin characterizes his life. Pride and arrogance characterizes his life. God judges him with a unique judgment. In other words, I'm trying to make the case for you that if you think you have been worse than others, this man has commanded armies into battle. They have gone and they have wiped out cities. If you think you have done evil against God, you cannot comprehend the evil that this man brought. Maybe you have seen evil that men can do to each other. Maybe you have a small glimpse of that. Whatever we think of Nebuchadnezzar, though, I would argue he is worse than you think. And yet God graciously works in this man. And so he's saying, I bless the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. You might say, well, okay, any king could do that. Kings are willing to say different things after all. But listen to the testimony as it continues. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven, among the inhabitants of the earth. None can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? I don't hear those words as an unbeliever, raising his fist against God or just doing a cloak of civility over his continued rebellion. No, what I see here is theology that is rooted in the teaching of Scripture. He's recognizing there is one king who reigns above all, Nebuchadnezzar included. Why go here at the end of 2 Samuel 17? Look, if David can know the grace of God, if Nebuchadnezzar can know the grace of God, can you not also know the grace of God today? If murderers and adulterers, if betrayers of nations, if this message can go out to all people of all kinds, can it not come to your ears today as well? Can you not also hear and receive this truth that as bad as your sin is, as shameful as it is, as full of guilt as you are today, there is a God who saves through Jesus Christ. There's a God who shows grace. There is one hope that you can have. There's one way that you can be brought to the Father, and that is through Jesus Christ. I would urge you, however much your own heart is condemning you today, there is one God who is working through all of these events on earth. And today this message is coming to you. God the Father sent his Son to die and bring salvation to those who had no hope, to those who were under his judgment. And that message is not just for people out there. That message is being brought to you today. That by believing that Jesus took the judgment of God and suffered in the place of sinners, that by believing that there is a God who forgives because of the death of Jesus Christ, you can have life and forgiveness and joy and freedom. And the salvation that God brings is so thorough that it even brings cleansing to the consciences of his people so that we can serve the living God. That is a message that you will not hear anywhere else. There is hope through Jesus Christ. We would have you hear that message. What do you do in response to that? You do what a sinner must do. You cry out to that God, clinging to Jesus alone by faith. You cry out and decide, I will trust in that Savior. I will trust in that God. For believers this morning, remember stories like this. Remember stories like this, and then look at your life and be willing to ask the question, what might God have commanded in my life to bring this about? You don't need to be able to fill the answer out. What you need to be able to do is continue trusting in him. And then see what's before you and be faithful. Father, you are great. There is none like you. You know the end from the beginning. While so much of your way is hidden from us, it really is okay. You've given us what we need in your word. And so I pray that you would fill us with hope, knowing that just as we see a glimpse here in the story, you are accomplishing your will, and nothing that can be done on this earth or in this universe can throw off your sovereign control of this universe. Please break into stony hearts even today. Break into hearts that are heavy with shame and guilt. Break into hearts that are hopeless and dark. Open eyes so that people would respond to Jesus by faith. And if they only hear the smallest glimpse of hope and they don't know the fuller story, they don't know what that even means, please bring them to somebody who can explain more of Jesus Christ, explain more of sin and salvation, that you are the God who forgives. God, rescue more lives from the judgment that they've already begun to experience. Thank you that you are at work. In Jesus' name.